Let me introduce you to Victor Hanson, who is a columnist for National Review and a professor of military history at the United States Naval Academy. Professor Hanson, there's a story Johanna Newman has in the Los Angeles Times today that the television ad featuring the little girl and the daisy from the Lyndon Johnson campaign is being revived starting this weekend by groups that are against the possibility of attacking Iraq. And in addition to that, it'll be airing in 13 major markets. It's part of a campaign by a coalition of peace groups. In addition to that, there are going to be anti-war rallies this weekend in San Francisco and in Washington. You've been thinking a lot about the people who are speaking out against Iraq. What do you want to say about them?
Well, I'd like to distinguish two groups. There's the mainstream debate that's going on, which seems to be about 55–60% one side that favors action in Iraq and 35–40–50 that does not, and that's Republican, Democrat, Liberal, Conservative, and that's a legitimate process. But there's also a strain in that debate of people who almost have a visceral dislike of the United States, and it's deductive, it's anti-empirical, it's not based on any particular incident. So, for example, when 9/11 occurred, there were members of that group who thought that rather than it being a tragedy, it was something that we did to warrant that attack. So somebody like Michael Moore, the film producer, would say that he was upset that there weren't more Bush voters, or that New York was a liberal place, so why did they do this to us? Or Oliver Stone saying it was creative destruction. Or Norman Mailer saying it was too ugly, the World Trade Center were too ugly buck teeth that looked better, that the ruins looked better than the actual buildings. So I was trying to account for what makes people usually in the media, in the universities, and the arts, have this sort of visceral, standard, almost Pavlovian response to misfortune that happens to the United States, and has a worldview that we're usually an agent of something wrong rather than right.
And when you looked and thought about that group, what kinds of conclusions did you come to about their roots, their genesis?
Yes, well, I wasn't so interested in the old debates, whether it's Marxist or whether it's left-wing. I was more interested in more utilitarian, practical explanations. And one of the things I noticed is if we look at Sean Penn or Martina Navratilova or Jessica Lange or Susan Sontag or Alice Walker, we see that a lot of this virulent protest against what America is and what it's doing tends to be centered in the arts, in the universities, sometimes the elite media. And I was trying to account for why that was so, and I came up with a couple of suggestions. One is that a lot of people in these areas are immune from the old insecurities of American life. We don't see it too much on the farm, the coal mine, the steel mill. I live on a farm in Central California, and I was struck that when I went up to the university, 90% of the English professors, or the history professors, or the sociologists would have a particular view about 9/11 that was not shared at all by the people that I grew up with and I worked with on the farm. So there was an unrealism, I think, in certain areas where their affluence and security don't lend them the opportunity to meet an Osama bin Laden, and there's plenty of them in America, or a Saddam Hussein that requires muscular strength rather than just rhetoric. Another is that there's a sense of frustration. A lot of these people are very unhappy because they have very nice lives, but they don't quite know how to extend that utopianism to America in general. It's very hard to disconnect from the engine of American capitalism. Sean Penn or Barbara Streisand, it's very hard for them not to fly in a polluting jet, or not to drive an SUV, or to give up hardwood floors, or not to walk on a redwood deck. And so one of the ways that these elite critics assuage this frustration is they tend to sign petitions, go to a protest, maybe having a sign as which we saw in C-SPAN, "Bomb Texas, I love Iraq," is a way of dealing with other frustrations you can't deal with. If you're really worried about the world, then do certain things that would affect your life in a very dramatic way. Put your kids in an integrated school, live in a poor area, intermarry with the other. But a lot of these people in the university and the media are just simply disconnected from American life, and that makes them feel these strange and sometimes antithetical emotions.
Because you have identified many of the critics as being in academia or in the arts, do they then have a disproportionately loud voice?
They do, and I think that's Sean Penn, by any qualification of intellectual achievement or knowledge or erudition wouldn't be a person people should listen to, much less Martina Navratilova, who escaped a slave communist society and came over here and made millions and then said that the United States was just a money-grubbing nation. Or Jessica Lange has no expertise to say that she's humiliated in being an American. But they have exposure to the public by degree of their celebrity status. There's also enormous pressure within these groups. I know that it's almost like the medieval church or the Soviet apparatchik, that when one states these positions publicly, one gets acclaim from within the cadre. If you're a professor, 90% of the professors that I've worked with for 20 years have particular views, and it brings dividends, both psychic and real, to profess solidarity within the group. Whereas if you say that you support the United States action in Afghanistan and we didn't do anything to deserve 9/11, that can bring, on a daily, hourly, minute basis, that can bring problems to you at work. So there's a lot of peer pressure involved as well as all these other emotions like guilt. There's also a little bit of envy, I think, that people who deal with words and whose expertise is rhetoric rather than muscle or business, they feel that sometimes they're not appreciated by American society. A professor of Renaissance literature might get less attention from a university president than the owner of a local Taco Bell franchise who gave money to the university. So there's a sense that the United States should recognize their intellectual achievement.
We want to open up our phone lines, and I should tell you, Professor, that without even introducing the phone calls, you've managed to light up all our lines here.
I have.
So people are anxious to talk to you. We'll get to calls in just a second. You can see the lines are below me on the screen right now, divided by party affiliation, and we welcome your calls. I might also tell you that we are going to televise the Washington rally on Saturday, the Answer rally, so you can hear some of the voices of those who are critical of the administration's policy. That will be live on C-SPAN beginning at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. And in the Washington Journal that morning, we'll talk to a couple of people who are on the other side of this issue, who are speaking out and would like to tell you why. Just to clarify your point, you believe that debate is a legitimate thing.
Yes, I do. I think it's very valuable. It's always been one of the unique characteristics of Western civilization, that it's welcomed dissident voices, and out of that conundrum we'll find the right answer in Iraq, whatever it is. But once we find that decision, we should rally behind it, whether it's not to go or to go as a nation. That's essential, whichever way you feel. I'm talking about a particular strain or fringe of that debate who has used the Iraqi issue as 9/11 issue, as Afghanistan, to voice a more deductive, virulent dislike of what America represents.
Let's go to our first call for you. It's from Medina, Ohio. You're on the air.
Yes, Professor, I tend to agree with you to a certain extent. The left wing, the massive left wing, is guilty of, they're traitors, and I see no use for them.
Well, I don't know if they would see themselves as traitors, but I'm a classicist as well as a professor of military history. When you have somebody like Sean Penn who travels to Baghdad in a time of hostilities, then that borders on the classical definitions of disloyalty. I don't think anybody would have done that in the eve of World War II, gone to Tokyo or Japan, or gone to Pyongyang during Korea. So that really disturbed me when he did that, especially when people address Iraqi officials and think that they're being asked because of their wisdom rather than their propaganda values. Very naive, if any. At least it's naive, and at worst it's near treasonous.
Pittsburgh, Kansas. Good morning.
Good morning. Yeah, this to Professor Hanson. I'm a professor of sociology, and I'm one of those 90% that you're talking about. And I would suggest that probably you should read Seymour Martin Lipset's book on the Divided Academy, and also his famous work on Political Man.
I have.
Where he really goes into a great deal of detail to talk about, academics, and he talks about, class positions and so on. I certainly agree with you that traditionally it has been middle-class youth, and that's all over the world. Korea, for example, where you have students basically protesting against their dictatorships and trying to transform their societies into a democracy. However, I certainly think that you're right about the celebrity issue, and that these same people seem to show up over and over again on these anti-war protests. But on the other hand, within the academic world itself, you certainly have a big division, and not to lump it. everybody into the same category, that you have business professors that are very, very conservative. You have people in the natural sciences who are also very, very conservative in terms of what Lipset and Ladd have to say. That, of course, I think that is our responsibility to present what I consider to be a really far more accurate understanding of what's going on, and especially in these period of time where I think the conservative side has really presented a very skewed understanding of what American foreign policy is all about.
Well, let me jump in so we can get a response. Thanks for the call.
I think you make some points there that the business schools and the engineering departments, perhaps even the natural sciences, tend to be a little bit more balanced and reflect the actual breakdowns or fault lines in American society. But the humanities are not. And we don't have a group that's as conservative as in the university as the humanities are liberal. And they tend to be the intellectuals that are prominent in the media. And the example of South Korea was actually germane to our discussion, because notice that the United States, through the loss of almost 50,000 American lives and millions of people who have served there for 50 years, created that bourgeoisie, capitalist, free society. And yet you have protests in South Korea against the United States, but nobody in South Korea would migrate to North Korea. Nobody in South Korea is demanding that American troops, at least in positions of responsibility, would leave. So there's almost a boutique nature even there, that they want to vent rage at the West, at capitalism, at America, but not to the degree that it would actually endanger their daily life by removing that tripwire and then dealing with a real North Korea that might be something quite different than they fantasize about.
This is the piece that we read, upon which we invited Victor Davis Hanson to the program. It was published on the 13th of January in opinionjournal.com. That's the Wall Street Journal site. Now, I do believe that is a paid site, so there is another place to read it as well, which you can get online for free, and that is nationalreview.com.
Yes, it is. It was there last week, and you can cross-list it.
And the piece is lengthy, and you are welcome to read more than we can give you in this half-hour conversation with Victor Davis Hanson. Next call is from New York City. Go ahead, please, New York. Welcome to the program.
Thank God for principled people like Sean Penn, who, even though George Bush has tried to turn our whole country into a Texas-style police state, can still find it within themselves to go and take a stand against this deranged war that people like this guy, who really are spewing the same old canards about the media elite that you hear from fanatic fascists like Rush Limbaugh. This guy here, his agenda is the same as the fanatical chicken hawks who strut up and down through the State Department every day, and who really have no other goal but to turn us into a vassal state of Israel. This guy just wants to send our youth over as chicken fodder and rather cannon fodder to press George Bush's deranged vendetta against Saddam Hussein. It's sick, it's disturbed, and people like this are just really in the great tradition of Joseph Goebbels. Instead of being a Nazi, this guy is just a Zio-Nazi stooge.
Very strong language. What would you like to say to him?
Well, I think that last caller sums up exactly what I was talking about. When you use words in a principled debate like fascist and stooge and Goebbels, you see that there's a group of Americans, not many, but who don't look at the situation empirically, but have this preconceived idea that any opposition or any free discussion that identifies these problems, that it must be fascism. One of the things I was struck with is the term of chicken hawk. So far in this war, the most dangerous place to be is in a high-rise in Manhattan. We're in a fourth-generational war where the American civilians are targeted, whether through anthrax or assassination. And maybe it's much safer, I think, to be in an aircraft carrier, at least so far in this war, than in a high-rise. So this idea that people in the Pentagon and the State Department are chicken hawks, that's where the first attack actually was. It's much more dangerous right now to be in the Pentagon than it is to be on a warship. So I think that was a very unfair accusation by the caller against people in the State Department or the Pentagon.
State College, Pennsylvania.
Hi. I'd like to address Mr. Hanson's attack more or less on the, I guess you'd call it the liberal left. I'm an independent from up here. I think, though, that some of these critics of the war tend to address some things that Mr. Hanson's not, and that is that this country has a habit of going about and supporting or investing in Saddam Hussein. We trained Osama bin Laden to some degree during the Russian involvement in Afghanistan. And so these people are receiving U.S. foreign aid after a fact, and in effect our foreign policy goes about breeding snakes. And if we breed snakes or